The smoke stains on Lira's right wrist were older than her assignment to the Iron Vale Palace. 3 years of working the rendering vats in the lower tannery had deposited a permanent grey-brown discoloration from her inner wrist to the base of her palm. Not a brand, not a scar, but a saturation, the way cloth takes a dye it was never meant to hold. She had learned, without being told, to keep that wrist turned inward, not from shame, from the observation that visible marks invited questions, and questions invited the kind of attention that made work harder. She was tallying the palace's grain distribution records that morning, a task assigned to her after the previous ledger clerk had made 3 errors in a single week, and the head steward had needed someone who wouldn't, when she heard the council chamber erupt. Not in argument. It's in the specific quality of silence that follows catastrophe, the sudden, total absence of sound from a room that had been full of it, the silence of men who have received news they cannot process while standing. She kept tallying. She noted the silence the way she noted everything, filed, held available, not yet relevant. The news reached the lower staff by the end of the day. The Alpha King Aldrich Ironvale had lost his mate in the night. No illness, no warning, no enemy action. She had simply not woken. The king had been found at dawn, still sitting beside her, in the posture of a man who had not yet decided what to do with the information. His twin sons, 11 months old, too young to understand and old enough to feel the absence like a missing wall, had not stopped crying since morning. The palace had 17 certified nursery attendants. By the 3rd day, not one of them had managed more than 40 minutes of quiet. Lira heard this the same way she heard everything, without expression, without comment, while doing something else. She was sorting the grain tallies by region when she understood what she was actually hearing. The crying had a specific frequency. She had heard it before, not from children, but from structures, from buildings with a compromised load-bearing element, when she had spent 2 years assisting the palace's maintenance architect before being reassigned to ledger work for reasons no one had explained to her directly. A compromised structure made a sound. It was not always audible. Sometimes it was simply a quality in the air, and a register that said, "Something that was holding weight is no longer here, and everything above it is waiting to find out what happens next." She finished the tallies. She put them in order. She went to find the nursery. She knew the palace's secondary passages, the way she knew its ledger discrepancies. By systematic observation over time, no detail discarded until its relevance was established. The nursery wing occupied the east residential corridor, accessible from the main stair and from a service passage behind the linen storage that had been marked on the architectural drawings she had reviewed 18 months ago as a maintenance access route. No one had told her she couldn't use it. No one had thought to. The head of the nursery staff was a woman named Voss, and she had the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years being correct about everything and was now in the specific hell of a situation where correctness was not the operative variable. She looked at Lira the way she looked at everything that didn't belong in her inventory, with the efficient assessment of a woman who would address the irregularity as soon as the current emergency allowed. Lira did not give her the opportunity. She crossed the room, sat down on the floor beside the larger of the 2 wicker bassinets, and began to do the only thing she knew how to do with a structural problem. She got close to it, she got quiet, and she began to listen for what was actually wrong. The twins were not hungry, they were not cold, they were not in pain in the way of illness. They were present in the specific way of very small creatures whose primary frequency, the voice, the warmth, the scent that had organized their world since before they had a world, had simply gone silent, and nothing being offered in its place was operating at the right register. Lira understood this, not as a mother, not as a nursemaid, not as anyone with training in the care of children. She understood it as someone who had spent years reading what was absent from structures by examining what remained. She looked at the 2 small faces, dark-haired, their father's jaw already legible in the soft architecture of infancy, their eyes red-rimmed and searching for something that was not in this room. And she identified what was needed the same way she identified a missing load-bearing column, by the shape of the absence. And she began to hum. It was not a lullaby. It had no melody in any conventional sense. It was a frequency, low and structural, the kind of sound she had discovered she could make during the long silent hours of ledger work, when she needed to keep her own systems organized and steady. It was not comfort exactly. It was more like confirmation, a signal that said, the structure is still here, the load is being carried, you can rest the weight you are holding. The larger twin went quiet first, at the 30-second count. The smaller watched her for another full minute, with his father's eyes, dark, measuring, not yet convinced. And then his shoulders dropped by 3 degrees, and the crying tapered and stopped. Voss stood very still in the center of the room. Lira kept humming. It was Voss who came to her afterward, when both boys had slept for 2 hours, and the nursery staff were eating their first real meal of the 3-day crisis. She stood in front of Lira in the service passage, with the expression of a woman who has just watched something contradict her entire professional framework and is deciding whether to be grateful or threatened. She chose threatened. "You are a grain clerk," she said. "You have no certification, no rank above 3rd domestic, and no business being on this floor. Whatever you did in there, it will not be repeated. The nursery is a credentialed environment. You represent a liability." Lira looked at her. She filed what she saw. The hands, clenched once and released. The jaw, slightly elevated. The specific texture of the authority she was projecting, which was not calm, but was performing calm with considerable effort. She recognized the performance, the way she recognized falsified tallies. The numbers added up, but the margins were wrong. "They're asleep," Lira said. "That is not the point." "What is the point?" Voss said, with a precision that told Lira the sentence had been prepared in advance. "You were born without rank, without wolf, and without anything that qualifies you to stand in a room with the Alpha King's sons. You are what you have always been. A ledger hand with smoke stains, who got lucky once." Lira let the sentence settle. She filed it next to the others she had collected over the years. The maintenance architect, who had reassigned her without explanation, after she had found 3 structural errors in his drawings. The placement officer at her first household, who had written in the record that she was unsuitable for advancement due to attitude, which she had later understood, meant she had noticed something he preferred. She hadn't. Each voice had added a line to the same ledger. Insufficient. Below load-bearing threshold. Not worth the column space. She went back to her grain tallies. She did not go back to the nursery that day. The next morning, a folded piece of parchment appeared in the ledger room with her name on it, in handwriting she did not recognize. It was not an order. It was an accounting notation, formal, precise, reassigning her to a secondary duty in the East Residential Wing, effective immediately, in addition to her ledger responsibilities. No explanation. The seal was the head steward's, but the handwriting was not his. Lira looked at it for a long time. Then she folded it, placed it in her record chest, and went to the nursery. The room had changed in 24 hours. 3 of the nursery staff had been rotated out. The twins were not calm, but they were no longer in the absolute register of the previous days. They were in the specific minor key of children who have found the edge of exhaustion and are sitting on it, waiting to decide which direction to fall. Lira sat on the floor. She hummed. Both boys moved toward her with the efficiency of small creatures who have remembered where the frequency lives. She began to learn the room the way she learned any environment she was required to work in. Systematically, nothing discarded. There was a carved wooden box on the high shelf to the left of the window. Dark wood, the clasp worn smooth from regular handling, positioned at an angle that suggested it was moved often. It did not belong with the nursery objects. It belonged to someone who came here regularly and set it down in the same place every time. There was a chair by the window, placed at a precise angle to both the room and the door. Not a comfort angle, not a decorative placement, but the angle of someone who needed to see the whole room and the entrance simultaneously without being seen to look. And there was a shallow groove in the stone floor beside the east wall, almost imperceptible, the kind of groove made by years of the same heavy object being set down in the same place. She measured the groove's dimensions in her mind. Whatever had rested there had been large, larger than furniture. The groove was paced, and not dragged. It had been placed deliberately, repeatedly, by something that moved. She filed the groove without comment. She was present when Alpha King Aldrich came to the nursery for the first time on the 5th day. She had heard him described at a distance in the vocabulary of consequence. What she saw when he appeared in the nursery doorway was a man who had forgotten to eat. She saw it the way she saw ledger discrepancies, not in the obvious column, but in the accumulated evidence of the margins. The specific way his weight was distributed, slightly forward, slightly unsustained, that said the body had been running on urgency for days, and the urgency had begun to consume the structural reserves. But the hollows beneath his eyes that were not grief alone, but grief, plus the particular depletion of a man who had been making decisions continuously for 5 days without the person who had always helped him make them. He did not look at her. He stood in the doorway and looked at his sons, and his face did something she did not fully have the vocabulary for yet. It was the face of a man looking at the only remaining thing the loss had not also taken, and trying to determine whether to go toward it or to continue standing at the exact distance that allowed him to keep functioning. She kept humming. Both boys were settled against her. The room held its breath. After 4 minutes, she counted, out of habit. He crossed the room, sat in the chair by the window, and said nothing. He did not look at her. He looked at the wooden box on the shelf. He had placed it there himself. She understood that now. She did not acknowledge him. She kept humming. The twins slept. Before he left, he looked at the groove in the stone floor beside the east wall. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Lira. His expression was not readable in any of the conventional ways. It was the expression of a man noticing that someone has read a room correctly, and being uncertain how he feels about being read. He left without speaking. She came every day. She learned his presence the way she learned everything, through evidence. The carved box moved from the high shelf to the lower shelf on the 8th day, a few inches closer to the room's center. The chair by the window repositioned on the 10th day, very slightly, and toward the rug where she sat with the boys. These were not conscious decisions, she suspected. They were the small, incremental movements of a man whose body was trying to close a distance that his judgment had not yet authorized. On the 12th day, she arrived to find him already on the floor. Not in the chair. On the rug, cross-legged, with the smaller twin asleep against his arm, and the larger one stacking small carved blocks beside his knee with the focused satisfaction of a child who has recently discovered that objects have relationships to each other. He was not performing fatherhood. He was simply present in it, with the quality of a man who had forgotten, for the first time in 12 days, to also be the king. He looked up when she entered. She sat at the other end of the rug and picked up one of the fallen blocks. He said, and after a long moment, "He stacks by size. He always has. Even at 7 months. She noticed it first." Lira placed the block she was holding beside the stack his son had built. She said, "He stacks by weight first, then size. The heaviest goes to the base even when it's smaller. He is making load-bearing calculations." She said it because it was true, not because it was comforting, but she understood, from the quality of the silence that followed, that it had been received as both. He did not come back for 2 days after that. She filed it as data, a man who had come too close to something real and needed time to decide whether that was survivable. On the 15th day, Voss appeared in the nursery with two members of the household council. She had written a formal complaint, she informed Lira, citing jurisdictional irregularity, the unauthorized access to a restricted residential tier, and conduct inconsistent with third domestic rank. The council members stood behind her with the expressions of people who had been told this was procedural and were now not certain it was. Lira said nothing. She kept her hands on the blocks she had been sorting with the smaller twin. The larger twin had moved to stand with his back against her knee, watching Voss with his father's eyes, the precise measuring quality she had come to think of as the family's primary instrument. The fourth person in the doorway was Alpha King Aldrich. He had come from somewhere formal. The full ceremonial weight of his rank was visible in the plating at his shoulders, the formal dark steel of his crest, and his expression was the one she had not yet seen. Not the private man from the rug, not the man at the window, but the king. He looked at Voss. He looked at the council members. He said, with a quietness that was not gentleness, but precision, "I was addressing my household. Anyone who has brought a complaint against a member under my protection can deliver it to the council chamber at my convenience." Voss said, "She has no rank entitling her to. She has my protection. That is the only rank that is relevant here." The council members looked at each other. Voss's hands did the thing Lira had been watching them do since the first day, that brief, involuntary contraction. Lira looked at her without hostility and thought, "You are not cruel because you are cruel. You are cruel because what I can do without credentials threatens every credential you have spent your entire career building. I understand the accounting. I do not excuse the arithmetic." After they left, Aldrich crouched beside his smaller son, who was offering him a block with both hands. She heard him accept it. She heard the quality of his breathing change. She said without turning, "She was right that I have no formal standing here." He said, "Are you telling me that to be honest, or to give me room to reverse course?" "To be honest, I have found it is usually the same thing." A pause. Then, "The groove in the floor by the east wall. You measured it." 11 days ago, she said. "I estimated the mass of what rested there at 300 to 400 kilograms. Low to the ground, dense, not furniture, something living." He was quiet for long enough that she turned and looked at him. He was holding the small carved block his son had given him. His expression was not the king's face. It was the face from the rug, the private one, the one that had not decided yet what it could survive. "He has not shifted since she died," he said. "The wolf. He will not leave the east room. He has not eaten. He has been present, in the way of something that has not decided yet whether to remain in the world. I cannot reach him. I have tried everything I know how to try." Lira looked at the east wall. She looked at the groove in the floor. She looked at the two small boys, who were both watching their father with the attentiveness of children, who do not yet have words for what they are witnessing, but understand that something important is occurring. She stood. She crossed to the east wall. She pressed her hand flat against the stone. On the other side, just barely audible, a sound, low, rhythmic, the specific cadence of an enormous creature in grief, breathing in the dark. She did not look at Aldrich. She began to hum. She felt the vibration travel through the stone under her palm before she heard anything change. Then, very slowly, the quality of the breathing on the other side altered by one register, then another. Then it was no longer grief breath, but something closer to attention, the specific alertness of a creature that has been alone in the dark for a very long time and has just heard something it recognizes as real. She heard Aldrich's breath catch behind her. She kept humming. On the third day of this, her palm against the east wall, the frequency traveling through stone, she heard the latch move, and the wolf that came through the connecting door was the size of a draft horse and moved with the specific heaviness of something that had not decided it wanted to continue being alive. His coat was the color of iron in winter light, dark grey, almost black, the color of the king's formal armor. His eyes were the same dark as his son's, and they were fixed on her with the quality of a creature who has been surviving on a single question and has just arrived at something that might be an answer. She did not step back. She understood, from her time beside structures that were compromised and unpredictable, that the correct response to imminent instability was not retreat. It was to become the most stable thing in the room. She went down on one knee. She extended her hand. When the wolf crossed the room in 4 steps and put his enormous head against her palm, his weight against her hand was immense and deliberate, the transfer of something that had been too heavy to hold alone. She held it. She kept humming. Behind her, she heard the larger twin make a small sound of recognition, the sound of someone who had been waiting for this information to confirm something he had known since the beginning. When she looked up, Aldrich was on the rug with both boys in his arms, and his face was doing something she had no vocabulary for. It was not grief. It was not relief. It was the expression of a man watching a door open that he had stopped believing could move. She came every day. The wolf ate on the 5th day after his emergence, a small amount, but deliberately, with the quality of something choosing to continue. On the 8th day, he moved from the east room to the nursery proper and settled beside the rug, his great dark head on his forepaws, and the smaller twin walked directly across his back without acknowledging this as remarkable, which seemed to be exactly correct. The 3 isolation objects had all shifted. The wooden box was now on the low shelf within the boy's reach. The chair had migrated fully to the rug's edge. The groove in the floor was now occupied every afternoon by the wolf, who had apparently decided it was the correct place to be. Voss came a second time on the 21st day, alone, without council members. The formal complaint architecture was absent. What she was carrying instead was the expression of a woman who has arrived at a door she has been standing outside for a long time, trying to decide whether the knock will cost her more than the silence. She said, "He hasn't slept in a real bed since she died. He sleeps in here, on the rug. I thought you should know that." Lira looked at her. The hands, quiet for the first time. The jaw, no longer elevated. The cool, finally genuinely present, rather than performed. "Why are you telling me?" Lira asked. "Because I don't know what you are," Voss said. "And I have been in service to this household for 22 years, and I have never seen the wolf come through that door." She left without another word. That night, Lira was the last one in the nursery. Both boys asleep, the wolf breathing evenly beside the rug. The room holding the particular quality of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something sufficient. She was looking at the smoke stains on her wrist when she understood something she had been carrying in her ledger of self for a very long time without fully reading the entry. She had been tallying herself in someone else's accounting system, Voss's system, the maintenance architect's system, the placement officer's system. Each of them had written her down as a figure below load-bearing threshold, and she had accepted the notation without auditing the method. She had been carrying a ledger entry as a fixed value that was, in fact, a calculation error made by people who had not known what to do with a variable they couldn't categorize. She looked at the wolf breathing. She looked at the 2 sleeping boys. She looked at the empty chair that had migrated to the rug's edge across 3 weeks of small, unannounced decisions. She had not been insufficient. She had been in the wrong column. The frequency that moved through her then was not dramatic. It was the quiet, specific release of setting down a load she had been carrying as though it were hers, because it had been handed to her young enough that she had stopped questioning who it belonged to. It moved through her the way a structural correction moves through a building. Not with violence, not with noise, but with the deep settling of weight finding its correct distribution. Both boys stirred in their sleep simultaneously, and then were still. The wolf raised his head, looked at her across the room, and then laid his head back down with the quality of something confirmed. She did not hear Aldrich come in. She became aware of him the way she had become aware of him in the beginning, through a change in the room's quality, the incremental adjustment of everything else in the space to the presence of its heaviest object. She did not turn. He sat beside her on the rug. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "I watched you find the groove on the first day. You measured it in your head. I could tell by how long you looked." She said, 11 days before you told me what made it." He said, "I wasn't ready to tell you. I wasn't ready for you to know that much of it. I am not certain I am ready now." She said, "You don't have to be ready. You just have to decide." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "She would have known how to say what I am trying to say. She was better at the words for things. And I have commanded armies for 15 years, and I do not have the words for this." She said, "What would the words be if you had them?" He picked up one of the carved blocks from the floor. He said, "That I have been sitting on this rug for 3 weeks telling myself it was for them." He set the block down in the space between them. "That I knew, by the 8th day, that it was not only for them." She looked at the block, the one she had placed in the shared space between herself and his son 3 weeks ago, as an act of structural precision. It was the same block. He had been returning it to that space every day. She understood that now. She said, "I noticed." He looked at her. The king's face was completely absent. What was present was the man who had forgotten once to be the king, and had been finding his way back to that forgetting ever since. He said, "Voss was wrong about you. Every characterization was wrong. I want you to know that I know it." Lira said, "I know it too. I worked it out recently." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but in the same category as one. He said, "You are the most precise person I have ever met." She said, "I have found it is usually more useful than the alternative." He looked at the block between them. He looked at the wolf, who was watching them both with the dark, steady eyes of something that had already made its assessment some time ago, and was waiting for the slower parties to catch up. He said, she very quietly, "I think I have been rearranging furniture, hoping you would read it the way you read everything else." She said, "I read it." He reached out, not dramatically, not with any performance, and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the rug. His hand was large and carried the specific weight of someone who had been holding too much alone for a very long time. She did not move. She let the weight settle. Then she turned her hand over and held his, the smoke stains on her wrist visible in the low light, and she did not turn them inward. He looked at her wrist. He said, "The rendering vats, 3 years." She said, "Before that I was reading architectural drawings for a man who reassigned me when I found his errors. Before that, a placement record that described me as unsuitable. Before that, a very long time of being in the wrong column in someone else's ledger." He was quiet. Then he lifted her wrist, the stained one, and held it in both his hands the way he had held the carved block, with the attention of someone who understood that objects carry histories, and histories are not flaws. He said, "You are the correct column. You have been from the beginning. The ledger was wrong." She had known this since the night of the settling. She had arrived at it herself, through her own audit, before he spoke the words. But there was a difference, she discovered, between knowing something and having it witnessed. The difference was not that one was truer than the other. It was that the witnessed version could be held by 2 people, and that distributed the weight more evenly than one person carrying it alone. And she did not say any of this. She said, "Your son stacks blocks by load-bearing capacity." He said, "He gets it from his mother's side." She said, He gets it from yours. You rearranged that chair 17 times in 3 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. The wolf shifted and resettled with the deep, deliberate ease of something that has been waiting for the exact configuration of the room to reach correctness and has now confirmed it has. He leaned his shoulder against hers. She felt the full weight of him arrive gradually, the way the largest structural loads always arrived. Not all at once, but in increments, the way of anything that has learned not to trust flaws. She did not move. She bore the weight. She had, it turned out, the correct load-bearing calculation for exactly this. Both boys slept on, undisturbed. The wolf breathed. The room held them all in the quiet that is not the absence of what had been lost, but the presence of what had been, carefully and without announcement, found.